We'll be taking a deeper dive looking at the currency markets and examining the euro versus the dollar and what's going on in the world currency markets as Europe falls apart in fiscal disaster. Welcome back. I'm your host, Bill Frank. Today we're going to take a deep dive into the currency markets to examine recent trends in the dollar and the euro with an expert currency trader and CEO of his own currency trading company. Joel Borshof is president and founder of IMEX. The company began in 1989 based upon the simple principle that smaller and mid-sized businesses deserve the same foreign exchange advantages nationally enjoyed by world's largest firms and financial institutions. Joel received his MBA from Bernard M. Bouch College, which is the University of New York, the City University of New York. Here's some interesting facts. Currency trading is a $3.9 trillion a day industry. Currency exchange drives the global economy and it allows businesses to operate internationally, but it's also completely unregulated. Currency trading takes place 24 hours a day. Joining us from New York, New Jersey area. Hi, Joel. How are you today?
I'm well, Bill. And yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing terrific. Thank you so much for returning to the show. And you return at a critical time because let's just start with the euro if we can. Early critics of the euro, including Great Britain and Norway that refused to join this unified currency, they believe that the eurozone may fall apart. And by the looks of things today, there are people here in the United States who feel the same way. So I want to ask you, as a currency trader, watching the euro, watching the exchange rates, what's the likelihood of the eurozone and the euro falling apart?
Well, this is something that a number of people that I know have been saying for years. They call it a currency without a country. And with taking that into consideration, it's very, very difficult to be able to manipulate your currency or use it to help you in negative times, in recession or depression. And the fact is that this is taking these many years to get here, but we're looking at all of the pitfalls and the issues that would, create the downfall of the euro. And the reality is, all these things are taking place on an economic perspective and a political perspective at the same time. So the issue is, I don't think at this stage that the European leadership or the ECB or the other organizations that are trying to maintain the euro for all the countries have really a solid plan on how to keep it going. Now, they're going to keep it alive by throwing more money at it and keep, lending to, let's say, either different countries or different, let's say, central banks that will need the capital to pull it out. But they've got a very, very difficult fight ahead of them. And the fact that they have to do this in an economic downturn makes it much, much more difficult. And, of course, all credibility is shot.
It does. Now, let me ask you, if what you say is true, if they continue to throw money at the problem in Europe, what are the likely implications for the world currency markets?
Well, it's going to stay extremely volatile. And it's going to be who said what last. The problem is the credibility of who said what last is going to disappear. At one time, they're able to support, a currency by, let's say, coming out with strong language saying, no, we're not going to let this happen. We're going to do this. We are, quote, I'll say, a lender of last resort. And then the market will calm down for a little while, and then something else would happen. And to that extent, that would just add more fire to the, fuel to the fire. And in that extent, will just make what they say less believable. If you remember quite a while back, I think you and I had discussed it once, we were talking about all of the sovereign bank tests. And I said it was a joke because they were allowing the banks basically to say, well, you don't have to count your sovereign debt exposure. And then they said, well, you can count your sovereign debt exposure as long as they're paying their interest. You can count it as, in full value. So they kept using, rhetoric and language basically to keep it moving, but they kept backtracking. And so to this point, you don't have any credibility across the board.
No, you don't. Joel, an equally plausible scenario would be for a troubled company, say Greece, for example, to withdraw from the Eurozone. So if Greece does withdraw, what are the implications for the euro? And then if they reintroduce the Greek drachma, what are the implications for the drachma?
Okay, let's take that one first. If it turns out that they do drop out and there is no regulations in the Maastricht Treaty, that was a treaty that was put together by the EU when they're putting together this understanding to basically throw out a fellow member. So Greece would have to basically resign on their own. Now, the reality of the situation is, and I think this last election that was held June the 17th, the Greek people are very, very unhappy at this particular point, and they're not happy to, basically with whatever arrangements or bailout conditions are being afforded them, but they recognize the fact that they really don't have a choice. At this stage, if Greece drops out of the euro and the drachma is reinstated, several things can happen. Number one, all the Greek banks will default. That's number one. Number two, the currency that they will turn around and issue, let's say it's the drachma or the new drachma, that'll be devalued almost instantly. And it takes a number of months, by the way, to reinstall a currency that basically you've taken away. And I guess that would be part of the process before they would drop out. But if they say, well, we'll devalue because we'll pick up, let's say, some sort of competitive edge. The reality of the situation is, no one, they will have no money to pay for imports because no one's going to want to take the drachma. They will not have the euro to be able to pay for these things. Their export industry is very, very small exports, and it's mostly agricultural. And if they drop out and the banks go out of business, and then businesses default and they go out of business, how do they continue the economy going? So now maybe 2, 3, 5 years down the road, they would come to grips with it and they would basically survive. But for the first couple of years, it'll be disastrous for them.
Well, that's a dire prediction. Now, what happens to the rest of the Eurozone if Greece drops out?
Well, it initially, it all depends on which side, again, who said what last, side of the story you're listening to. They say, well, gee, it'll be one less issue, a problem that the EU has, but keep in mind that Greece is just 2% of the entire GDP for the entire European community. There'll be, as it is now, contagion. The reality is, the Cyprus banks, for instance, has a large exposure to Greece and Greek banks. They have just recently asked for a bailout loan for their banks as well. That's aspect number one. Aspect number two, you see today Moody's downgraded somewhere between 25, 30 banks, Spanish banks. In effect, will push up again their borrowing costs. And to that extent, by the way, that's another thing that I didn't really cover. If Greece drops out, and if anyone would lend them money, their borrowing costs would go through the ceiling, in which it would bring in hyperinflation. So it would be a nightmare scenario in Greece. Europe will be affected, even if they say, well, we got rid of one issue or one problem. I don't want to use the word get rid of, but the reality of the situation is you have problems with Spain. You have problems with Italy. You have, France obviously has now joined the side saying, hey, the austerity programs are too much and we have to focus on growth. By the way, I don't disagree with that at all, because the reality of the situation is if you keep cutting back and cutting down your expenses, but you're cutting payroll, you're cutting people off that have pensions. Well, at least if this consumer can't spend money, there's no way that you're going to be able to grow the market. And in effect, you'd go from a recession to a deeper recession.
It is an unvirtuous cycle, no doubt, Joel. So let's turn our attention to King Dollar, if we can, for just a minute. Look at the U.S. dollar. The dollar index has risen from 7.31 back in June of 2011 to where it closed today around 82.46. Now, interestingly, you know that Ventura County is the home of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and one of the very first things that Ronald Reagan did when he took office was institute a strong dollar policy. So give us an overview. What's the current state of the greenback? Is the dollar simply the best-looking house on an ugly block?
Short answer is yes. The U.S. dollar remains and you listen to this word, the default currency of the world. It's not necessarily, it is the choice, but not by, hey, we love the dollar because the economy is so good. If you recall, we were discussing the reserve value, the reserve title that was given to the U.S. dollar a while back. And it's come back because now, at one stage, when the dollar was losing some of its popularity, it had fallen to about 60% of the world's reserves. Now the central banks are buying up the dollar like crazy, besides any other major investment groups, and for the protection. And that's the only reason. They don't really feel, hey, the economy here is so great, but we've moved up from a 60% of the world country's reserves to 62%, which is a huge move.
That
so,
is a big
yes,
jump.
we are king of the hill again, but we're king of the hill because there is no other safe place to go.
All right, so bring it home for us, Joel, because the strong dollar has both good implications and bad implications. Here in Ventura County, we're an agricultural county. We export a lot of our ag products to the rest of the world. How is the strong dollar going to impact us as we export food products to the rest of the world?
Well, we have two obstacles here, though. Number one, by having a stronger dollar, it makes our goods more expensive to the let's say, Europe and to South America and to China and to even Russia, I think, in certain agricultural products. The problem is, by those areas being weaker, it weakens their currency, makes our goods more expensive, independent of the dollar being stronger, but because their currency is weaker. And if their currency is weaker, it makes us less competitive, and that will not allow us to really be the major steam engine of the world to bring the rest of the world back up with us, because it's going to affect our exports and their imports. So to that extent, we have an uphill battle here. And the key thing, and I'm sure you've heard this before, it's jobs. You know, for our economy to continue to get stronger, we need to focus on jobs. And unfortunately, you know, corporations, they're sitting, onshore with a couple of $1 trillion, offshore a couple of $1 trillion, but they have no need or no reason to invest in hiring new people, because with the technology and their abilities, they can produce what they want to produce with their present employment staff. But we have an issue too here. I mean, look, the reality is we are borrowing at record low price rates. Our interest costs are low. It allows us to keep our mortgage rates low. But if people don't have jobs, then they're not going to be turning around and buying either durable goods. They're not going to be buying homes. I think I just heard something that a lot of the young people, students from the ages of 22 to 35, are moving back into their homes with their parents because they can't afford their own place. And so all of these people are not part of the market buying, of new homes and all of the other products that, furniture and repairs and all the things that go with it. Unfortunately for us, until we create more jobs somehow, somewhere, unless Congress starts working together, we will have our own issues too.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, Joel. My guest has been Joel Borshof. He's the CEO and founder of IMEX. Joel, thank you so much for joining us here on the Ventura County Nightly Business Report.
My pleasure. You have a good day and a good weekend. If I can help you, please don't hesitate.